13 years of other people's trash sitting on the edge of Hazel Briggs' lower pasture. And the morning they finally sent a lawyer to take away what little she had left. She walked out to that pile before she walked into the house. She stood there in her work boots, the leather split along the left toe, hands shoved into the front pocket of her canvas apron. The pile was massive. It always had been, but that morning it looked different to her. It looked like proof of something. She just hadn't figured out yet what it was proof of. The lawyer's car was still visible at the end of the gravel drive, a clean white sedan with a Pennsylvania vanity plate. He had left a manila envelope on the porch railing. She hadn't opened it. She already knew what was inside. She looked at the pile for a long time. Then she went inside and started the coffee. That was October of 2012. But to understand what happened in that kitchen and what happened in the months after, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the summer of 1999 when Hazel and Cole Briggs drove a borrowed pickup truck down a dirt access road in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and looked at 38 acres of rolling pasture land that nobody else wanted. Cole was 42 that summer. Hazel 40. 11 years of careful saving had produced a truck with 240,000 miles on the engine and a woman who cut her own hair. They had spent those years in a rented farmhouse outside of Harrisburg, him doing contract work for a feed distributor, her doing alterations and custom sewing out of a converted garage. The saving had not been quick or easy. It was the kind that requires you to say no to things you want very badly for years at a time. They had one vacation in 11 years, 4 days in the Poconos in the fall of 1994, and they talked about it afterward the way people talk about the best meal they ever ate. The 38 acres in Lancaster County was everything they had saved for and nothing anyone else would have taken. The soil in the upper pasture was good. The farmhouse, built sometime in the 1880s, was structurally intact, which meant the foundation was sound and the roof was holding, which was the most they could say for it. The lower pasture sloped gently toward a natural drainage ravine along the eastern edge of the property, and the grass there was thick and sweet, the kind that merino sheep would graze down to the root and thank you for it. He had read every Penn State Extension bulletin on sheep farming, driven to operations in Ohio and New York on weekends, and filled a notebook with production calculations going back to 1996. Cole was prepared for nearly everything the land could ask of him. There was only one thing the calculations hadn't accounted for. The man from the county assessor's office mentioned it almost as an afterthought, standing at the edge of the lower pasture on the day they closed. He pointed east toward the massive brick complex visible above the tree line, its smokestacks idle that afternoon, its presence filling the horizon like a small city. "That's Harwick Textile," he said. "Been operating since 1891. You'll want to read the zoning attachment on page 9 of your deed before you get too settled." Cole read it that night at the kitchen table while Hazel made supper. He read it twice, then a third time. He set it down and said, "There's an easement." She turned from the stove. "What kind, son?" "The kind from 1911. Says they have the right to use the drainage ravine along our eastern line as an overflow site for biodegradable natural textile byproducts." She was quiet for a moment. She turned back to the stove. How often, the document doesn't say. They found out that November. The truck came on a Tuesday morning. Hazel heard the diesel engine from the upstairs bedroom and looked out the window to see a 10-ton commercial dump truck backing slowly toward the chain-link fence separating their lower pasture from the Harwick property line. The truck's bed rose. A mountain of tangled, multicolored yarn cascaded over the fence and into the ravine with a sound like a slow avalanche. Cole watched from the fence line, hands at his sides. Hazel watched from the upstairs window. The truck drove away. The pile sat there. It was roughly the size of a small house. Over the following months, Cole made phone calls. He wrote letters to the county. He attended 2 township meetings and stood at a wooden podium under fluorescent lights and showed photographs of the pile growing against their fence. The people on the council listened politely. They had been listening to concerns about Harwick Textile for 40 years. Harwick employed over 300 people in a county of 22,000. It was the kind of employer that makes elected officials careful with their words. At the second meeting, a man in a charcoal suit sat in the front row and did not look at Cole when Cole was speaking. He looked at his phone. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the woman beside him and said something quietly that made her smile. His name was Raymond Steele. He was 31 years old, held a master's degree from Wharton, and had been promoted to regional operations manager at Harwick Textile 8 months earlier. He carried the smooth, unbothered confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion he valued. When Cole finished, Steele stood without being called upon. He buttoned his jacket. The material being deposited in the easement zone is 100% natural, untreated fiber, he said. It is fully biodegradable under the terms of the 1911 variance attached to the Briggs property deed. Harwick is operating entirely within its established legal rights. He paused. If Mr. Briggs had concerns about proximity to an active industrial operation, those concerns should have been raised before purchase. He sat back down. The council voted to take the matter under further review. Nothing changed. The trucks kept coming, twice a week, every week, through the winter and into the spring. The pile grew. It pushed against the chain-link fence until sections of it bowed outward. When it rained, the soaked yarn emitted a thick, suffocating smell of wet animal fiber and raw lanolin that drifted across the lower pasture and sometimes reached the farmhouse on still mornings. In summer, the pile altered the drainage of the pasture, backing up runoff into the low ground, turning 20 acres of good grazing land into a muddy, unusable swamp from June through September. Cole built a secondary fence 10 feet inside the property line to keep the sheep away from the main pile. He lost the use of the lower pasture almost entirely. He adjusted his calculations. Hazel said nothing about it for a long time. She had started doing something that nobody noticed at first. Every morning, before Cole was up, she would walk down to the lower pasture with a small canvas bag and a brown notebook. She would crouch at the edge of the pile and study it. She would pull sections of yarn loose with her bare hands and hold them up to the light. She recorded the color, the thickness, the texture, the approximate date of deposit, the behavior of the fiber when wet versus dry, all of it in the same careful hand. Page after page, notebook after notebook. Cole came down one morning in February of 2001 and watched her from the kitchen window for several minutes before he understood what he was seeing. At breakfast, he asked her what she was doing. She looked at him over her coffee cup. Watching, she said. He waited for more. It didn't come. He had been married to her for 14 years by then. He knew there were things Hazel understood about fiber and material that he would never fully grasp. Her grandmother had run a weaving operation out of a farmhouse in eastern Tennessee for 30 years. Her mother had taught her to spin on a drop spindle before she was 8 years old. After high school, she had spent 2 years working on the floor of a small textile mill in Hagerstown, Maryland, running the cards and the draw frames, learning the way fiber behaved under tension and heat and pressure. She was not watching the pile the way a person watches something they hate. She was watching it the way a person watches something they are trying to understand. The neighbors did not share her patience. By 2002, the pile was visible from the county road. Drivers would slow down to look at it. A man named Dale Whitmer, who ran a dairy operation 2 properties over, had taken to calling it the Briggs Monument whenever he was at the feed store in Lidditz. He meant it as an insult. He said it loud enough for people to hear, and the joke spread the way jokes spread in small agricultural communities, slowly and completely. At the 3rd township meeting in the spring of 2002, when Cole again asked the council to review the terms of the easement, Whitmer raised his hand from the back of the room. With respect, he said, "The problem at the Briggs farm might not be the mill." He paused to let a few people chuckle. "I've seen Mrs. Briggs out there every morning sitting with that pile like it's a pet. Maybe instead of changing the easement, she could get it a name." The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Hazel was sitting in the second row. She did not turn around. She looked at the table in front of her and wrote something in her notebook. Cole put his hand over hers. She did not look up. Raymond Steele was in the front row again. He smiled at the table. In the parking lot afterward, Cole walked fast toward the truck and didn't speak for several minutes. She walked beside him, the notebook tucked under her arm. He finally said, "We should get a lawyer." She opened the truck door. "That easement has been attached to that land since 1911. A lawyer isn't going to move it. Then what are we supposed to do?" She got in. She looked out the windshield at the dark parking lot. "Keep watching," she said. He drove home. He did not understand her, but he had been married to her for 14 years, and he had learned that there were moments when not understanding her was the correct response. The notebook she carried that night was the third one she had started. The first two were full. The years moved the way hard years do, which is to say quickly in memory and slowly in living. The sheep operation produced a modest income. Cole supplemented it with off-farm work, doing equipment repair for neighboring farms, driving a feed delivery truck 2 days a week during the busy season. They were not failing. They were not comfortable. They were in the narrow corridor between those two things where most working farm families spend most of their lives. Hazel had a small loom in the spare bedroom. She had built it herself over 3 weekends in the fall of 2000, using plans from a library book and lumber from a collapsed outbuilding at the back of the property. It was not a beautiful loom. It was functional. She used it to weave small pieces from their own sheep's fleece, selling what she could to a craft supply store in Lancaster and through a classified listing in a regional fiber arts newsletter. She also, quietly, began bringing small amounts of fiber from the Harwick pile into the house. Not to use, not yet, to study. She had noticed something that nobody else had bothered to look at closely enough to see. The outer surface of the pile, the material exposed to Pennsylvania weather for months or years, was indeed deteriorated, matted, darkened, foul-smelling, and in some sections essentially composted back into the earth, but the interior was different. The sheer volume of raw lanolin present in the unprocessed fiber had created an effect she had read about once in a monograph on traditional Scottish wool storage. Lanolin, the natural waxy secretion produced by wool-bearing animals, had migrated outward from the interior fibers and essentially sealed the core of the pile against moisture. The outer layer had sacrificed itself. Everything beneath it was preserved. Not just preserved, pristine. She took a section from 3 feet inside the pile in January of 2003 during a hard freeze, working alone at 5 in the morning while it was still dark. She brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table under the overhead light. The fiber was a heavy, wildly irregular blend. Harwick's industrial looms ran at very high speed and required absolute uniformity. If a batch of spun yarn deviated from the programmed thickness by more than a fraction, the automated sensors rejected it. The fiber itself was not defective. It was simply too alive, too variable, too unpredictably textured for machines designed to process perfect uniformity at industrial scale. She held it in both hands. She pressed it between her palms. She stretched it slowly between her fingers and watched the way it recovered. The staple length was extraordinary. The crimp was deep and regular. The handle was unlike anything she had worked with before. A combination of the coarse, resilient strength of Highland wool and the dense, buttery softness of alpaca. Two fibers that had no business being as compatible as they were, and yet somehow were. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she went to the spare bedroom and stood in front of the loom. Her first attempts failed, not because the fiber was poor, but because the loom was built for standard yarn weights and could not manage the extreme variability of the Harwick material. Some sections were as thick as her thumb, others tapered to a strand barely heavier than conventional worsted. A standard loom structure required consistent tension across the entire warp, and consistent tension was exactly what this fiber refused to provide. She pulled the failed pieces apart and thought about it for 3 weeks. Then she rebuilt the loom. She used the two heaviest oak beams from the old outbuilding, the ones she had left aside the first time because they were too massive. She redesigned the heddle mechanism using bolts from Cole's workshop and sections of heavy chain instead of traditional string heddles. She built a new beater bar from a length of iron pipe and hung it from the ceiling with two heavy-duty gate hinges so it could swing with variable force rather than a fixed stroke. It looked nothing like a conventional loom. It looked like something a blacksmith had dreamed about. The first piece she wove on the new frame took 11 days. When she cut it off, it was roughly 5 feet by 4 feet and weighed 19 pounds. She put it on the kitchen floor. Cole came in from outside, took off his boots, turned around, and stood very still. Then he crouched down and put his hand on it. He ran his palm slowly across the surface. The weave was dense and deeply three-dimensional, the varying thickness of the yarn creating peaks and valleys across the face of the cloth, shadows and highlights moving as his hand moved. It did not look manufactured. It looked grown. It looked like something that had always existed and had simply been waiting to be found. He looked up at her. She said, "It took me 4 years to figure out what the loom needed to be." He looked back at the piece on the floor. "What are you going to do with it?" She went to the stove and poured herself coffee. "Make more," she said. Through 2004 and into 2005, she wove whenever she had time, mostly in the early mornings before Cole was up and in the evenings after supper, one large piece roughly every 2 weeks. She stacked them in the spare bedroom, rolled and labeled with strips of masking tape on which she wrote the date, the fiber composition, and the dimensions. In the fall of 2005, she loaded 3 pieces into the truck and drove to a home goods boutique in Lancaster that she had been watching for several months, the kind of store that sold things that cost more than they looked like they should. She had been in twice before, on foot, carrying nothing, just walking through and looking. The woman at the counter unrolled the first piece and looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "I don't carry handmade." "I know. I'm not asking you to carry it. I'm asking you to look at it." The woman touched the surface without enthusiasm. "What is the material?" "Recovered alpaca and Highland wool blend. Hand processed. Hand woven." "Where does the alpaca come from?" "Lancaster County." The woman looked up, clearly skeptical. "There are no alpaca operations in Lancaster County." Hazel looked at her steadily. "There's one," she said. "It's a textile mill. They throw it away." The woman rolled the piece back up. She said she would think about it. Hazel drove home. She never heard back. She went back to weaving. The 2008 financial collapse hit Lancaster County the way it hit every agricultural community in Pennsylvania, hard and all at once. Feed prices spiked. The price for raw fleece dropped by 40% in 6 months as overseas synthetic fiber undercut every domestic natural fiber producer in the region. Cole lost 2 of his 3 off-farm contracts by January of 2009. He picked up night work at a machine shop in Ephrata, driving 40 minutes each way, coming home at 2 in the morning, smelling of cutting oil, eating whatever was on the stove, and sleeping 4 hours before starting the farm day. Hazel paid the electric bill for 3 straight months in late 2008 by selling 2 woven pieces to a woman she had met at a fiber arts show in Lidditz, who resold them at a market in Philadelphia. $400 for both. Not enough. Something. The bank sent its first foreclosure warning in March of 2009. Cole read it at the kitchen table. He set it face down. He did not speak. She took the letter, read it, and put it in the drawer beneath the telephone. Then she said, "I need the truck Saturday." She loaded 6 pieces into the truck bed and drove south and east, hitting 2 boutiques in Baltimore and 2 more in Pittsburgh over 2 days, sleeping in the truck cab overnight at a rest area outside of Hagerstown. Every boutique declined. Two of them did not even unroll the pieces fully before handing them back. At the last stop in Pittsburgh, a young buyer at a home furnishings shop looked at the largest piece for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "This looks like something my grandmother would have thrown out." Hazel rolled it back up. She drove home. She did not tell Cole what had been said. She went back to the loom. She pulled apart the two oldest pieces, the ones from 2004 that had never sold. The ones she had always felt were technically correct but wrong in a way she couldn't name. Under a magnifying glass, she studied the warp structure and identified the problem. The pieces were too even. She had been working against the irregularity of the fiber instead of with it, unconsciously trying to impose order that the material itself was refusing. The result was a piece that looked handmade in a way that read as imprecise rather than intentional. She rewove them. This time, she let the thick sections dictate the rhythm of the beater. She let the thin sections create transparency. She stopped fighting the fiber and started listening to it. The pieces that came off the loom in 2010 were not the same as the pieces from 2004. They were not the same as anything she had seen in any boutique or design publication or craft catalog. They had the visual weight and dimensional density of an architectural element. They did not look like floor coverings. They looked like landscape. She drove back to Pittsburgh in September of 2010, not to the shop that had turned her away, to a different one on the north side, newer, smaller, with concrete floors and pendant lights and a hand-lettered sign in the window. The owner was a woman named Patricia Vance. She unrolled the first piece herself and did not speak for almost 2 minutes. Then she said, "Where have these been?" "My spare bedroom." Patricia Vance bought 4 pieces at $900 each and asked how quickly more could be produced. Hazel drove home. She stopped at a gas station outside of Harrisburg and sat in the parking lot with her hands on the wheel and the engine off. The check was in the glove compartment, $3,600, more than Cole made in 6 weeks at the machine shop. She started the truck and drove the rest of the way home. Cole was in the kitchen when she walked in. He looked at her face and said nothing. She set the check on the table between them. He picked it up. He looked at it for a long moment. She said, "I need to tell you what I've been doing for the last 11 years. He put the check down and folded his hands on the table. She sat across from him. She opened the notebook to the first page. Dated November 1999, the first entry described the initial truck deposit, the fiber type, the volume estimate, the smell, the color variations. Every subsequent page was the same, meticulous, dated, precise. 12 years of observation, 460 pages. He turned the pages slowly. Outside the kitchen window, the pile in the ravine sat exactly where it had always sat, large and damp and multicolored and immovable. It had been sitting there for 13 years. The township had never made Harwick move it. The county had never enforced any restriction. Raymond Steele had stood in public meetings and called it a legal right and walked out without looking back. Cole set the notebook down. He looked at his wife across the table, and she looked back at him. And for the first time in 13 years, she let herself say out loud what she had believed since the January morning in 2003 when she had pulled a strand of fiber from 3 feet inside a frozen pile of industrial waste and held it up to a flashlight in the dark and understood exactly what she was holding. She said, "They have been throwing away the most valuable material on this property for 13 years, and they don't know it, and they don't know that I know." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do we do now?" She looked at the check on the table. She looked at the notebook. She looked out the window at the pile in the ravine. "We need more buyers," she said. "A lot more. Bigger than Patricia Vance." She paused. "And we need to move faster. Before someone notices the pile is getting smaller." She did not sleep that night. Cole went to bed at 10, the way he always did when the next day started before sunrise. Hazel sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her and a cup of tea that went cold without being touched. She was not reading the pages. She was thinking past them, into the months ahead, into the problem of scale. Patricia Vance could move 4 pieces a month, maybe 6 if the Philadelphia market held. 6 pieces a month was not a business. It was survival money dressed up as progress. She needed volume. She needed a buyer large enough that Harwick Textile and Raymond Steel would become, in every practical sense, irrelevant. She did not yet know how to find that buyer, but she had spent 13 years learning to be patient with things she did not yet know. She closed the notebook. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark beside Cole and listened to the sound of the farm settling around her. By morning, she was already at the loom. The months that followed were the most productive of her life and the most exhausting. She wove 6 days a week, rising before 4, working in the spare bedroom by the light of 2 clip-on shop lamps until Cole called her for breakfast. After farm chores, she came back to the loom. After supper, she came back again. He began bringing her coffee without being asked, setting it on the small table beside the loom frame, not interrupting, not lingering. He had understood by then that the loom room was not a place for conversation. It was a place for work of the kind that requires the same quality of attention that surgery requires, or navigation by stars. The pieces coming off the loom now were larger than anything she had made before. She had reconfigured the frame a third time, extending it by 18 inches on each side using sections of heavy angle iron Cole had cut for her at the machine shop. The largest pieces now measured 9 feet by 11 and weighed between 40 and 60 pounds depending on fiber density. Moving them off the loom required both of them, him on one end, her on the other. Rolling the finished piece slowly forward onto a length of cotton muslin laid out on the floor. She had 11 finished pieces stacked in the spare bedroom by February of 2011. She had orders from Patricia Vance for 4 more. She had nothing else. Then, in March, she heard about High Point. She read about it in a trade journal from the periodical section of the Lancaster Public Library, a publication called Home Furnishings Business that she had never looked at before. High Point Market in North Carolina was the largest furnishings industry trade event in the world. Twice a year, October and April, over 75,000 buyers, designers, and manufacturers descended on a mid-sized city in the Piedmont to conduct the business of the American home interior industry. The October market was the larger of the two. It was where major brands previewed their fall and winter collections, where independent makers occasionally broke through, and where purchasing decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars were made over 5 days. She read the article twice. She wrote the dates in the notebook. She did not tell Cole right away. She spent 2 weeks thinking about whether what she was considering was possible. And then she stopped thinking about whether it was possible and started thinking about how to do it. The October 2011 High Point Market ran from Saturday the 22nd through Thursday the 27th. The drive from Lancaster County to High Point, North Carolina, was 6 hours and 40 minutes without stops. A registered exhibitor badge cost more than they had in the household account. Hazel did not have an exhibitor badge. She did not have a contact inside the market. She did not have a sales representative or a showroom or a brand identity beyond her own name written in permanent marker on strips of masking tape. What she had was a truck, 3 of the largest and best pieces she had made, and a 13-year notebook that she packed into her canvas bag the morning she left, not because she planned to show it to anyone, but because she had never traveled without it. Cole could not go with her. That was the part that had taken her 2 weeks to accept. Harwick Textile's accounting department had filed a routine property boundary review request with Lancaster County in September, and the county had notified Cole that a representative would arrive on October 23rd to conduct a formal survey of the Briggs property line. If he was not present to sign the inspection acknowledgement, the county had the authority under the easement terms to conduct the survey without a property owner representative, which in practical terms meant Harwick could use the survey to expand the designated easement zone uncontested. He had to be there. She had to be in North Carolina. She left at 4 in the morning on October 21st. Cole stood in the driveway in the dark and watched the taillights disappear down the gravel drive. He stood there for a moment, after the lights were gone, Then he went back inside, poured himself coffee, and sat at the table with the notebook, which Hazel had left open to the first page, and read it from the beginning for the first time. The drive south took her through Maryland and Virginia in the dark, the truck loaded with 3 rolled pieces wrapped in canvas tarps and secured with ratchet straps. She stopped once for gas outside of Roanoke and bought a cup of coffee from a machine that tasted like hot water with ambitions. She was back on the road before the attendant finished counting her change. She arrived in High Point at 11 in the morning. The city looked as though it had swallowed a convention and was trying to digest it. Delivery trucks blocked intersections. Design professionals in expensive shoes moved briskly between showrooms. The permanent furniture market buildings, enormous brick structures that dominated the downtown, were surrounded by temporary exhibition structures and outdoor installations. Every surface carried a logo or a product name. She found a parking spot 6 blocks from the main market complex, the closest she could get with a full truck bed. She pulled the smallest of the 3 pieces out, the one that was 8 feet by 9 and weighed 41 pounds. She wrapped it tight, hoisted it onto her right shoulder, and walked 6 blocks through a North Carolina October morning that was warm enough to make her canvas jacket feel like a mistake. She did not have a badge. The main entrance had badge scanners. She walked the perimeter of the nearest exhibition building until she found a secondary entrance used by delivery personnel, where a man in a loading dock vest waved her through without looking up from his clipboard because she was carrying something heavy and people carrying something heavy were supposed to be there. Inside, the building held dozens of showrooms arranged along wide, carpeted corridors. She walked slowly, reading the signage above each entrance, looking for something specific. She had done her research in the library. She was looking for Stonefield Living. Stonefield Living was a home furnishings brand based in Charlotte, North Carolina, that had spent the previous 4 years repositioning itself from a conventional catalog retailer into a curator of what its new ownership called Elemental American Design. They had abandoned their previous product line almost entirely and rebuilt their collection around raw materials, natural textures, reclaimed elements, and objects with legible histories. Their new creative director had given an interview in the trade journal Hazel had read, and he had said something she had written in the margin of the notebook. He had said, "The thing I cannot source anywhere in this market is genuine weight. Everything being made today is trying to look substantial. I want things that actually are." The Stonefield Living showroom was near the center of the building. Wide entrance, no door, just an open threshold framed by 2 panels of rough-sawn timber. Inside, the display space was organized around large natural elements. A dining table made from a single cross-section of a fallen walnut tree, pendant lights made from cast-iron agricultural fittings, wall panels of reclaimed barnwood. The floors were bare, polished concrete. And they were empty. She stood at the threshold and looked at those empty floors for a moment. Then she walked in. A young man in a pressed shirt moved to intercept her. He looked at the rolled canvas on her shoulder and then at her face. "Can I help you? I need to show something to whoever is buying textiles for the fall collection." He looked at the roll again. "This is a closed preview. Are you a registered exhibitor?" "No." He reached for the radio on his belt. The roll shifted on her shoulder. She adjusted her grip, and the adjustment sent the lower end of the canvas swinging outward, and the corner of it connected with the shin of a man who had been standing just inside the entrance, looking at something on a clipboard. The man said nothing. He looked down. The canvas had partially unrolled at the impact point, and a section of the piece inside, roughly 2 feet of the lower corner, had spilled out onto the polished concrete floor. The man crouched. He was 53 years old, gray at the temples, wearing a jacket without a logo and shoes that were not expensive but were very well made. His name was Marcus Ford. He had been the president and creative director of Stonefield Living for 4 years. He had spent the previous 2 days walking the market and had not found a single textile that made him feel anything. He crouched and looked at the corner of the piece on the floor without touching it. Then he reached out and placed his palm flat on the surface. He stayed crouched for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. She looked back at him. He said, "Put it down." She unslung the roll from her shoulder and set it on the floor between them. She crouched on the opposite side, and they unrolled it together across the bare concrete, her pushing the roll forward, Ford guiding the leading edge flat with both hands. The piece opened across the floor of the showroom. Under the gallery lighting, the surface topography of the weave threw shadows across itself. The deep, architectural texture of the fiber created the impression of something geological, something compressed over time into a density entirely different from the manufactured softness of commercial textiles. Ford stood up slowly. He walked the perimeter without speaking. He stepped onto it and stood in the center and looked down. He crouched again and pressed 2 fingers into the weave and released and watched the fiber recover. The young man with the radio was still standing near the entrance. He had not called anyone. Ford looked at her. "What is the fiber-recovered alpaca and Highland wool blend? Industrial byproduct. I hand process and hand weave it. Recovered from where? A pile on the eastern edge of my farm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. A textile mill next door has been throwing it away twice a week for 13 years. He looked at the piece on the floor. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How many do you have?" It was not a question. It was the kind of sentence that only sounds like a question when you are not listening carefully. 11 finished, 3 in the truck. Can I see the 3 in the truck? She went back to the parking lot. She needed 2 trips. Ford met her at the secondary entrance on the second trip and carried one end of the heaviest roll without being asked. They spread all 3 pieces on the showroom floor alongside the first. The 4 pieces together transformed the space completely. The bare concrete room, which had looked spare and deliberate, now looked inhabited in a way that no other element in the showroom had achieved. Ford's assistant, a woman who had said nothing during the entire episode, took photographs on her phone without being directed to. Ford stood at the edge of the arrangement and looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "I want to talk about supply." That was where she stopped him. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out the notebook. She set it on the walnut table at the center of the room. She opened it to the first entry, November 1999. She told him everything: the easement, the trucks, the 13 years, the lanolin preservation, the loom built from oak beams and iron pipe, the failed boutique trips, the night she slept in the truck cab outside Hagerstown, Patricia Vance, the $400 check that paid 3 months of electric bills. Ford listened without interrupting. When she finished, she reached back into the bag and placed a second document on the table beside the notebook. It was the cease and desist letter from Harwick Textiles' legal team in New York. She placed it without comment. He picked it up. He read it. He set it back down. He looked at her. She said, "I don't have a supply problem. The pile on my property is enough fiber to produce at this scale for 8 to 10 years. What I have is a legal problem. And 60 days before a bank takes my farm." Ford looked at the notebook. He looked at the cease and desist. He looked at the 4 pieces spread across the floor of his showroom. He picked up the notebook and carried it to his assistant, who was still holding her phone. "Get Jonathan on the phone," he said. "Tell him I need him in Lancaster County by the end of the week." He set the notebook back on the table in front of her. He said, "Jonathan Mercer is our senior corporate counsel. He has been looking for a reason to go after an easement abuse case for 2 years. He is going to enjoy this considerably." He looked at the pieces on the floor one more time. "I don't want 11 pieces, Mrs. Briggs," he said. "I want the collection. I want the whole story, and I want to call it what it is." "What is it?" He looked at her. "It's the most honest thing I've seen in 4 days of looking." She drove back to Lancaster County that night. She did not stop in Roanoke. She made it home by 2 in the morning, pulled into the gravel drive, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark cab of the truck for a moment with her hands in her lap. The farmhouse lights were off. Cole was asleep. The Harwick complex on the eastern horizon had its usual nighttime glow. The security lighting along the roofline, the amber wash over the brick facades, the slow pulse of the exhaust venting from the processing wing. She looked at it for a moment, then she went inside. Cole was up before 6. He came downstairs and found her at the kitchen table with fresh coffee and the notebook open to a new page. She had already written the date and the details of what had happened in High Point. She looked up when he came in. He said, "How did it go?" She poured him coffee. Then she told him. He sat across from her and listened without speaking. When she finished, he looked at the notebook. He looked at the cease and desist still on the table. Then he said, "You drove back through the night?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee. She watched him. He said, "What does the lawyer need from us?" "Everything in that notebook," she said, "and anything else we can document about the pile. Photographs, measurements, the county survey records from September." He set his mug down and stood up. "I'll pull the survey records after chores," he said. He went outside. The screen door swung shut behind him. She looked at the empty doorway for a moment. Then she turned to a new page in the notebook and kept writing. Jonathan Mercer arrived the following Thursday in a dark green rental car. He was 47 years old, lean, unhurried, and wore the kind of clothes that said he had stopped trying to impress people some years ago and found the experience liberating. He shook Cole's hand in the driveway and Hazel's and looked at the farmhouse and the outbuildings and the lower pasture before he said anything professional. Then he looked at the Harwick complex over the tree line and said, "How long has that been there?" "Since 1891, Cole said. Mercer nodded. "And the easement was attached to the deed when you purchased?" "Yes." "Show me the pile." They walked down to the lower pasture. Mercer stood at the fence line and looked at the ravine for a long time. No photographs, no notes, just looking, the way a man looks when he already knows what he is going to find. The pile was still enormous. Hazel had been careful to harvest only from sections not visible from the Harwick side of the fence line. From the mill's perspective, from any drone footage they might have, the pile appeared largely undisturbed. "How did they find out you were using the fiber?" Mercer said. "Drone footage," she said. Steele noticed the pile was decreasing. He looked at the fence line. He looked at the mill buildings beyond it. "And the cease and desist characterizes the fiber as proprietary corporate materials being temporarily stored." "Yes." He smiled. It was a quiet smile, the kind a man makes when something confirms a calculation he had already made. "That's a very expensive word choice," he said. They walked back to the farmhouse. Mercer sat at the kitchen table with the notebook and read it from the first page without stopping. He read for 40 minutes. Cole and Hazel sat across from him and did not speak. Occasionally he would stop and look at a date or a notation and then continue. When he finished, he closed the notebook and placed his hands flat on the cover. He said, "This is not a defense document. This is an offense document. There's a difference." Cole looked at Hazel. She looked at Mercer. "Harwick's lawsuit claims the fiber is stored corporate property." Mercer said, "The moment they filed that language in a legal action, they reclassified 13 years of open-air deposits on agricultural adjacent land as commercial storage, unzoned, unlicensed, without environmental containment." He paused. Pennsylvania's Clean Streams Law and the Federal Clean Water Act both carry provisions for unlined industrial material storage in proximity to a protected watershed. The drainage from your lower pasture feeds into Mill Creek Tributary, which is a designated Class A wild trout stream under Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission classification. Lanolin runoff has a documented effect on pH levels in cold water fisheries, Cole said. "We're downstream from them." Mercer looked at him. "Yes," he said. "You are." He looked at the notebook again. This is 13 years of contemporaneous documentation showing the date, volume, and material composition of every deposit. It predates any record Harwick has of their own disposal operation, which means your wife's notebook is the most complete environmental impact record of this easement in existence. Their lawyers don't know that yet. He looked at Hazel. They are going to know it very soon. Raymond Steele did not know any of this when he drove out to the Briggs farm on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks later. He came in a black company-plated SUV and brought with him 2 attorneys from the New York firm that handled Harwick's litigation. He had asked for a settlement meeting. He had framed it as an opportunity for the Briggs family to resolve the matter without further legal exposure. He expected Cole to answer the door in work clothes. He expected to sit at a kitchen table and make an offer that a man with a foreclosure notice and no legal representation would accept because he had no other option. He did not expect the dark green rental car already parked in the gravel drive. He sat in his SUV for a moment after he pulled in. He looked at the rental car. He looked at the farmhouse. Then he got out and walked to the door. Hazel answered it. She was wearing her canvas apron. Her hands were clean. She said, "Come in. There's coffee." Steele walked into the kitchen and stopped. Jonathan Mercer was seated at the table with a document binder and a legal pad. He looked up briefly, assessed, and looked back at his notes. Steele's 2 attorneys exchanged a glance. Cole was standing by the window with his coffee mug. He looked at Steele without expression. Steele said, "Who are you?" Mercer said, "Jonathan Mercer. I represent Stonefield Living as co-counsel for the Briggs family and as their exclusive wholesale distribution partner. Sit down, Mr. Steele. We have some things to show you." Steele did not sit immediately. He looked at Mercer. He looked at Cole. He looked at Hazel, who had moved to the counter and was pouring coffee with her back to him. He sat down. Mercer opened the document binder. He placed 3 items on the table in sequence. The first was a 40-page environmental assessment conducted by an independent firm out of Philadelphia that Stonefield's legal team had commissioned the previous week. The second was a formal notification letter from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection acknowledging receipt of a preliminary complaint regarding uncontained industrial byproduct storage in proximity to a Class A watershed. The third was a single photograph, a high-resolution aerial image of the ravine showing the full extent of the pile along the Briggs property line, with GPS coordinates and a scale marker. Mercer let Steele look at the photograph. Then he said, "Your lawsuit against Mrs. Briggs characterizes the material in that ravine as proprietary corporate assets temporarily stored for future use. I need you to confirm that language is accurate before we proceed." Steele looked at his attorneys. The senior one, a man named Holloway, gave a very small nod. Steele said, "That is the position of Harwick Textile." "Yes." Mercer wrote something on his legal pad. "Then I want to walk you through what that position has cost you." He did. He was precise and unhurried. He explained the reclassification. He explained the Clean Streams Law exposure. He explained the watershed adjacency. He explained what 13 years of unlined open-air industrial storage within 50 feet of a Class A tributary represented in terms of potential EPA enforcement action. He placed the environmental assessment on the table and turned to the page containing the estimated remediation liability. Steele read the number. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The number was $9.4 million before penalties. The DEP notification we filed last week initiates a mandatory review process. Mercer continued, "You have 90 days to demonstrate voluntary remediation cooperation before the agency moves to formal enforcement. Formal enforcement carries additional per-day penalties under the Clean Water Act at the federal level." He paused. Holloway was writing very fast on his own legal pad. "Here is what we are proposing." Mercer said, "Harwick Textile drops the theft lawsuit against Mrs. Briggs immediately and without conditions." Harwick signs a transfer of ownership document conveying all rights to the material currently present in the ravine to Hazel and Cole Briggs. In exchange, the Briggs family assumes full responsibility for remediation of the storage site, which they will accomplish through their existing reclamation operation at no cost to Harwick. The DEP preliminary complaint is withdrawn upon execution of the agreement. Steele said nothing. He was looking at the environmental assessment. Mercer placed the notebook on the table. Hazel reached across and opened it to the first page. Steele looked at it. 13 years of contemporaneous documentation. Mercer said date, volume, fiber composition, environmental observation. Every deposit your trucks made is recorded in that notebook in Mrs. Briggs's handwriting. It is the most complete impact record of this easement in existence. It was compiled without legal counsel, without institutional resources, and without any expectation of what it would eventually become. He let that sit for a moment. Steele picked up the notebook. He turned several pages. He set it back down. He looked at Hazel for the first time since he had walked in. She was sitting across the table from him with her hands folded. She looked back at him the way she had looked at the pile on winter mornings for 13 years. Patient, attentive, entirely unafraid. Steele looked at Holloway. Holloway kept his eyes on his legal pad. He had nothing to add. Steele reached for the pen Mercer had placed on the table. His hand was not entirely steady when he signed. The pen made a dry sound against the paper. Nobody in the room spoke. Holloway closed his legal pad. The second attorney began returning documents to his briefcase with the careful movements of a man who wanted very much to be somewhere else. Steele pushed back his chair, stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the kitchen without looking at either of them. The screen door swung shut behind him. A moment later, the SUV started in the gravel drive, and then the sound of it moved down the road and was gone. Mercer capped his pen. He looked at the signed transfer document for a moment, then slid it into the binder and closed it. Cole set his coffee mug down on the counter. He looked at his wife. Hazel was still sitting at the table with her hands folded. She was looking at the notebook, which was still open to the first page. November 1999. The first entry, the first truck, the first deposit. She reached out and closed it. That was October 2012. What came next did not happen quickly. Nothing about what the Briggs family had built had ever happened quickly. And the months following Steele's signature were no different. There was no single morning when the farm transformed. There was no ceremony, no check arriving in an envelope, no moment when everything was suddenly resolved. There was only the next day, and the work that came with it, and the slow accumulation of days into something that eventually looked, from a certain distance, like a life rebuilt. The foreclosure notice that had been sitting in the kitchen drawer since March of 2009 was formally withdrawn in November of 2012. Mercer had included a provision in the transfer agreement requiring Harwick Textile to assume the outstanding loan balance on the Briggs property as part of the remediation offset calculation. It was a detail that had taken him 40 minutes to argue and that had cost Steele visibly to concede. The bank received payment in full on a Tuesday. The letter confirming it arrived on a Friday. Hazel put it in the drawer where the foreclosure notice had been. Cole found it there 3 days later when he was looking for a pen. He read it standing at the kitchen counter. He set it back in the drawer without comment. Later that evening, when she came in from the loom room and sat down across from him, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers and kept it there for a moment. That was the extent of the celebration. It was enough. The agreement gave them full rights to everything in the ravine. The pile, measured by Mercer's environmental team during the assessment, contained an estimated volume of recovered fiber sufficient to sustain production at expanded scale for 9 to 11 years. She had always known approximately what was in there. She had been calculating it for years in the notebook. But seeing the number confirmed in a legal document by professionals with instruments was different from knowing it herself. It made the thing real in a way that her own certainty had not quite managed. She began planning the expansion immediately. The barn on the north side of the property had not been used for active farming in several years. Cole had been storing equipment in it, keeping the structure sound but not putting it to full use. It was a good barn. The foundation was stone, the frame was post and beam. The roof had been reshingled 4 years earlier. Hazel walked through it on a cold December morning with a measuring tape and a flashlight and made notes in a new notebook. The first one she had started that was not about the pile. She designed the washing and processing setup herself, working from principles she had learned on the mill floor in Hagerstown and from technical publications she had ordered through interlibrary loan over the years. She needed a washing station that could handle fiber and volume without the mechanical agitation that would felt the raw material. She needed a drying rack system that could manage the weight of wet fiber without compression. She needed a carding setup scaled to handle the extreme variability of the Harwick blend without trying to normalize it into something it was not. She also needed more looms. Marcus Ford had come to Lancaster County in November, a week after the agreement was signed, to walk the property and see the operation firsthand. He brought his creative director and a woman named Sylvia Oakes, who managed production relationships for Stonefield Living. They walked the lower pasture and looked at the ravine and stood in the barn and looked at the loom in the spare bedroom. Ford said very little during the walk. Sylvia Oakes took measurements and photographs. The creative director stood in front of the loom for a long time without speaking. On the drive back to the house, Ford said, "How many of these looms can you build?" "As many as I have room for and people to run them." He looked at the barn. "How long to convert that structure?" She looked at it. 3 months if we start now," she said. 6 if we wait for spring." They started in January. The construction was Cole's domain entirely. Concrete pads for the washing stations went in first, then the drying loft framing, then the anchor hardware for the loom frames, fabricated by hand at the machine shop in Ephrata. He hired 2 men from the county, former agricultural workers between seasons who needed the income, to help with the heavy work. They showed up when Cole said to show up and worked until he said stop, and the barn took shape through January and February and into March. Hazel designed 4 additional looms. She built the first one herself over 3 weeks, refining the design she had developed for the spare bedroom machine, scaling it up for the barn dimensions and higher production volumes. The second and third looms she built with Cole. The fourth she built with a woman named Grace Whitfield, who had come to the farm in February responding to a single index card posted on the bulletin board at the Lancaster County Agricultural Extension Office. The card said only "experienced weaver or textile worker wanted, serious applicants only." Grace was 61 years old, had spent 20 years as a production weaver at a mill in York that closed in 2003, and had been doing alterations work out of her kitchen since. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, looked at the spare bedroom loom, sat down at it without being invited, ran her hands along the frame, pressed the beater twice, and said, "Who built this?" Hazel said, "I did." Grace looked at her. "When can I start?" By April, Grace was running 2 looms in the barn simultaneously and training a younger woman named Donna Marsh, who had no textile background but had hands that understood tension and patience from 15 years of working a horse farm. Hazel was producing on 2 of the barn looms and still using the original spare bedroom loom for experimental pieces, new configurations, new fiber combinations, variations she was developing for the next phase of what Stonefield was calling the Harrow Valley Collection. Sylvia Oakes came back in April with the production schedule. Stonefield Living was planning the collection launch for their fall catalog, with a gallery preview event in Charlotte in late September, 40 pieces by August 1st for the catalog photography, an additional 60 for the initial retail inventory, 100 pieces in 4 months. Hazel looked at the schedule. She looked at the barn. She looked at Grace and Donna on their looms. "We will need 1 more person," she said. Sylvia said, "Can you find one?" "I know who to call." She called Patricia Vance in Pittsburgh. Patricia was not a production weaver, but she knew everyone in the regional fiber arts community who was, by the end of the week, a woman named Eunice Talbot, who had spent 30 years teaching textile arts at a high school in Hagerstown before retiring, had driven down to Lancaster County, walked through the barn, and accepted a position before Hazel had finished explaining the compensation structure. 5 women in a barn in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. 4 looms running 6 days a week. The pile in the ravine being harvested in controlled sections, processed in the washing stations, dried in the loft, carted and prepared and fed to the looms. A notebook on a work table near the door that Hazel updated every evening before she left, the way she had always updated it, recording what had been made and what remained. The work was hard in the way that real work is hard, demanding and repetitive and occasionally painful and entirely satisfying. Her hands, already calloused from years at the loom, developed new calluses in new places from the expanded pace. Grace's back required her to stop every 2 hours and stretch for 10 minutes, which she did with the discipline of someone who had learned that ignoring the body's requirements costs more than accommodating them. Donna Marsh broke 3 shuttle frames in the first month before she found her rhythm. Eunice Talbot wove with a precision that made the others stop and watch sometimes, her movements so economical and assured that the loom seemed to run itself. Cole kept the rest of the farm going, the sheep herd, the pasture maintenance, the equipment, the endless small repairs that a working property requires. He also managed the fiber inventory, tracking what came out of the ravine and what went to processing, cross-referencing with the notebook to ensure the harvesting sequence preserved the structural integrity of the remaining pile. He did this with the same careful attention he had always given to things that mattered. He did not talk about it much. He just did it. Harwick Textile sent no more trucks. The twice-weekly deposits had stopped the week Steele signed the transfer agreement. The cessation was abrupt enough to be noticeable. Hazel had expected it. She had factored it into her supply calculations. The existing pile was sufficient. She had known that for years. What she had not known, what she could not have predicted, was what the absence of the trucks would feel like. She noticed it on the first Tuesday after the agreement was signed. She was at the lower pasture fence at her usual time, just before dawn, checking the harvest sections she had marked the day before. She waited without being aware she was waiting. The sound of the diesel engine did not come. The sky got lighter. The birds started. The farm came up around her the way it always did, in layers of sound and light, and there was no truck. She stood at the fence for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went back to the barn. The Stonefield Living Catalog for fall. 2013 featured the Harrow Valley collection across 14 pages, more space than any single product line had received in the brand's history under Ford's direction. The photography had been done at the farm in August, a crew of 6 spending 3 days in the barn and the pastures and the farmhouse. They photographed the looms in motion with Grace and Donna and Eunice working. They photographed the ravine from the fence line, the remaining pile visible in the background. They photographed Hazel's hands on the fiber. They photographed the notebook on the work table, open to a page from 2004. Ford had written the catalog copy himself, which was unusual. He sent it to Hazel before publication. She read it once, made no corrections, and sent it back. The catalog shipped in late September. The gallery preview in Charlotte sold out in the first 2 hours. The first production run of 60 pieces was back-ordered within 3 weeks of the catalog release. Stonefield's customer service line received calls asking specifically about the origin story. Design publications requested interviews. A writer from a national home furnishings magazine drove out to Lancaster County on a Thursday and sat at Hazel's kitchen table for 3 hours. She answered every question directly and without embellishment. She showed him the notebook. He held it carefully, as though it might dissolve. The article ran in December under a headline she did not choose and would not have chosen, but the article itself was accurate, which was the only thing she had asked for. Through 2013 and into 2014, the production scaled. A 5th loom was added in the spring, A woman from the county agricultural office asked whether Hazel had considered applying for a small business development grant through the state's Rural Enterprise Program. She filled out the paperwork at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening and mailed it the following Monday. The grant came through in July and covered the cost of 2 additional washing stations and a new drying system that reduced processing time per batch by 30%. Raymond Steele left Harwick Textile in January of 2013, 3 months after the agreement was signed. The official statement from the company said he had resigned to pursue other opportunities. Nobody from Harwick reached out to the Briggs farm. Nobody sent a letter or made a call. The easement remained attached to the deed as it always had, but with the amended provisions Mercer had inserted into the transfer agreement, provisions that restricted Harwick from making any new deposits without prior written consent from the property owners. No new deposits were ever requested. Harwick Textile Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in March of 2015. The filing cited declining domestic textile margins, overseas manufacturing competition, and accumulated regulatory liabilities. The regulatory liabilities section referenced an outstanding DEP remediation agreement connected to a Lancaster County easement dispute settled in 2012. The settlement costs, combined with the loan payoff provision, had been significant enough to appear in the bankruptcy documents as a contributing factor. Hazel read about the filing in the Lancaster newspaper. She read the article once at the kitchen table with her morning coffee. She noted the relevant details in the notebook. Then she turned to a new page and began her daily production log. The bankruptcy auction was held in June of 2015 at the Harwick complex on a Tuesday morning. Cole drove. Hazel wore a clean shirt and her better work boots, the pair without the split along the left toe. They arrived early and walked the perimeter of the building before the auction began, not speaking much, just walking. The brick was old and solid. The roofline was intact. The interior, visible through the loading dock doors, was vast and cool and smelled of machine oil and decades of compressed fiber. Cole looked at the main warehouse floor through the open dock doors. He looked at his wife. She said, "That's the space." For what? More looms. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the floor again. How many more? She looked at the ceiling height, the beam span, the column spacing. 12 to start. He nodded slowly. The bidding on the main warehouse was thin. Most of the serious buyers were interested in the manufacturing equipment, the industrial looms, and the fiber processing machinery, which were auctioned separately in the afternoon. The warehouse building itself, stripped of its equipment and carrying the remediation agreement provisions in its title, attracted limited interest. Hazel bid twice. The second bid won. She accepted the auctioneer's paperwork, signed where indicated, and handed Cole the carbon copy. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. They walked back to the truck. He unlocked the passenger side first, the way he always did. She got in. He walked around and got in the driver's side and started the engine. He looked at her. She looked straight ahead through the windshield at the brick facade of the building she had just bought, the building that had sent trucks to her fence line twice a week for 13 years. "You want to go look inside?" "Not today." He put the truck in gear. They drove out of the parking lot and onto the county road and headed back toward the farm. Neither of them spoke for several miles. The Lancaster County fields moved past the windows, the summer corn already shoulder high, the pasture grasses rich and full from a wet spring. They passed the turnoff for the old agricultural extension office, where Hazel had posted the index card that brought Grace Whitfield to her door. They passed the feed store in Lidditz, where Dale Whitmer had made his jokes about the Briggs Monument. The feed store had changed ownership twice since then. Whitmer had sold his dairy operation in 2011. Cole turned onto their road. The gravel of their own drive was visible ahead. The farmhouse, the barn, the lower pasture, the ravine along the eastern edge with its depleted but not exhausted pile, still substantial, still giving. He slowed the truck at the point on the driveway where the ravine first came into view. He stopped. They looked at it through the windshield. The pile was perhaps a third of what it had been in its largest year. The years when it had pushed the chain link fence into bowing sections and turned the lower pasture into a swamp. What remained was dense and settled, compressed by its own weight into something that looked almost geological. From this distance, you could not tell what it was. You would have had to come close and put your hands into it and pull back the surface layer to understand what was underneath. Hazel had done that in the dark, in a January freeze, in the 4th year after they bought the farm, and what she had found had required 11 more years of patience and work to become what it was now. Cole put the truck back in gear. They drove up to the house. The barn was running. The sound of the looms was audible from the driveway, a rhythmic, complex sound, multiple beaters moving at slightly different cadences, the way a piece of music sounds when several instruments are playing the same theme at slightly different tempos. She had always liked that sound. She liked that the barn was never silent during working hours. She liked that it had become a place where something was always being made. She went inside the farmhouse and changed out of her better shirt and put on her work clothes. She pulled on her boots. She picked up the notebook from the kitchen table. She went out to the barn. Grace was at her loom. Donna was at hers. Eunice had gone home at noon that day because of a doctor's appointment, but her loom had been set up for the next piece. The warp already threaded, the shuttle loaded, ready to go. Grace looked up when Hazel came in. She looked at her face. "Well, Titiwai," Grace said, "we have a new building." Grace looked back at her loom. She adjusted the tension on the near side and threw the shuttle. She caught it on the return and beat the weft down and threw it back. "How many looms?" 12 to start. Grace nodded. She did not stop weaving. Donna said, "Are we going to need more people?" Hazel set the notebook on the work table by the door. She opened it to a new page. She picked up her pen. The first entry on the new page was the date. Below it, in the same careful hand that had recorded the first truck in November of 1999, she wrote Harwick Warehouse, June 2015. 12 looms to start. She said, "I know who to call." She sat down and began to write. The fence that had separated the Briggs farm from the Harwick property for over a century came down in August of 2015, 3 months after the auction. Cole took it down himself over 2 days, pulling the posts with a tractor-mounted chain, rolling the chain link into sections, stacking the posts along the access road for salvage. Where the fence had stood, the ground was marked by post holes in the compacted soil of the old easement zone, a long, thin scar running the full length of the eastern property line. Hazel walked that line the morning after the last post came out. She walked it slowly from the northern corner to the southern corner, the full length of the boundary that had defined the shape of their trouble for 16 years. The ground under her feet was uneven and dark with the accumulated residue of what had been deposited and what had been reclaimed. She walked to the center of the line and stopped. The Harwick building was visible to the east, its brick facade unchanged, its smokestacks still, its loading docks quiet. It was her building now. The conversion would begin in September. 12 looms. To start. More as the work required. She looked north along the pasture to where the farmhouse stood in the summer haze, its windows catching the morning light. She looked south toward the ravine where the pile still sat, smaller now, patient. She looked at the ground under her feet. She had stood here many times over 16 years, always on one side of a fence, always looking at something that belonged legally to someone else and that she had understood, in ways she could not yet articulate but had never stopped believing, was already hers. The fence was gone. The ground was the same ground it had always been. She was standing exactly where she had always stood. She turned and walked back to the barn. The looms were running.
chase the horizon, certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken, I've known fear that stole my breath, I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher, every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear it becomes a path for those who tread. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. For the climb. One day I stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what can I learn? The moment I embraced the fire lost its power to burn. For every challenge holds a gift, though hidden from the eye. The obstacle and destination were never separate all this time.